So today we'll be learning about quality management systems or QMSs. And quality management systems are ubiquitous and fundamental in many different types of industries, not just medical device, pharmaceutical, or biomedical industries in general, but many industries that govern automotive, healthcare, FAA regulations, all oversee and maintain and require that companies maintain a quality management system. So, for our purposes, QMSs are intended to serve as a framework for not just this course and how we operate in this sort of simulated medical device environment, but also help prepare us post graduation as we work in industries that require us to operate within a QMS. So let's learn more about them. A quality management system is a structured framework of policies, processes, procedures, and resources designed to ensure an organization consistently produces products or services that meet customer expectations, regulatory requirements, and industry standards. Like I said, they're widely used across a variety of industries, not just the healthcare or biomedical industries. Now, ISO 1345, which is going to dictate how we operate within this course, is going to serve as our framework for understanding QMS system, is itself an international voluntary standard that's specific to the medical device industry. So it's not a law, it's not a regulation, but as we're going to learn about a little bit later, a lot of our regulations are inspired by 1305, or ISO 1345 was in itself inspired by our and other international regulatory body requirements and regulations. Now, the core purpose of this international standard is to ensure product quality and safety. Its objectives are to foster a risk-based approach to quality management, provide a framework for compliance with regulatory requirements across global markets, and support continuous improvement to maintain high standards of patient safety and product reliability. Now, since we're discussing laws, codes, and standards, I want to dive a little bit deeper into what each one of those represents and what they are, and how they influence what we do, and even provide a little historical backdrop so we can understand how these things came about. So a lot of it starts with the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, which was the very first regulation that established any kind of need to have any kind of federal oversight to drugs and food. Later came the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which was another spiritual successor and started to instill a lot of our manufacturing compliance and needs with pharmaceuticals. Now, it wasn't until 1976 that any of these mentioned medical devices at all. That's where the Medical Device Amendment of the original Food Drug Act came about. And that was the very first time that on a federal level, we started to regulate medical devices. And then later came the 1990 Safe Medical Device Act. And then in between those and much later, there were many, many iterations of amendments and further amendments upon these to sort of capture the evolving landscape to pharmaceuticals, food, cosmetics, and medical devices and our need to regulate them. Now, congressional acts are by themselves laws, but if you ever look at any kind of congressional bill, none of it gets any kind of specific in how to go about these things. They're all broadly worded. So what we need are codes that are a lot more detailed to sort of codify how to go about complying with a particular law. So as an analogy, in general, there are state, there are federal, there are municipal regulations and laws that dictate how houses need to be safe. And they might say something very broad and generic like, hey, houses need to be safe, but they don't describe why. And that's where we get housing code. So if a contractor or an architect wants to build a house to code, the minute details that describe what kind of wires can carry what kind of amperage, where to put light sockets, how long or how wide your plumbing tubes need to be. Those are all within codes. And that's why you say, oh, my house is up to code. We need to build this to code. And codes can evolve and be changed regularly in order to maintain and evolve with continual technological improvements or discoveries about any kind of building material that's being used. So codes evolve pretty quickly and routinely, whereas laws might need congressional intervention to amend something or change something. So one is broadly worded and isn't changed very often and takes a high bar in order to be enacted, whereas codes can change on the fly as needed as technology evolves and changes, or as we discover new things about current technologies. They can be changed much more readily while still being in compliance and within the spirit of the original law. Now, the main law, the main codes, I should say, that govern what the FDA does and how medical device manufacturers have to be in compliance with the FDA is Title 21 of the Congressional Federal Regulations, CFR. Now, within Title 21, Part H20 is what describes the FDA's requirements for quality management system. Now, pre-1996, that focused entirely on good manufacturing practices. So everything post-development and during the and after manufacturing of a device. So how to manufacture things reliably to an appropriate standard, how to verify and validate that they are still within compliance with any manufacturing specifications or product specifications, that they're sterile, that they're shipped properly, and so on. After 1996, the FDA actually started introducing quality and design needs within the design and product development phase itself. So we'll get into that actually a little bit later as well. But so that's sort of the evolution of the United States congressional acts and the FDA codes that codify how to be in compliance with those. Engineering standards, on the other hand, are what are called voluntary standards. They're not laws, they're not codes. You don't get in trouble if you break them, but they're standards that are developed by experts within a particular field that decide, hey, here's how we would design something as we deem most appropriate. They're designed by national and international bodies. Experts come together to dictate what they're said, and they're available for adoption by any regulatory agency, any country's codes to be inspired by them, but they're not codes in themselves. Now, they were the first ones. This was pre-FDA. ISO 9001 was the first international standard that described quality management systems. It was introduced in 1987 before FDA codes started to implement them themselves. Now, ISO 9001 is a broad standard that describes quality management systems that can be adopted for any particular field. So not just healthcare, not just biomedical engineering. FAA adopts ISO 9001. Automobile manufacturers adopt these. And then from that came about the need to design a specific standard that adopted a lot of those same principles, but were specific to medical devices. And that's what 1345 is. It's called Medical Devices Quality Management Systems Requirements for Regulatory Purposes. It was first introduced in 1996. Now, its framework was based on Title 21, Section 820 of the Congressional Federal Regulations. It's since then been updated and amended much more readily because it doesn't take nearly as enough power or executive authority to change it. And since then, FDA codes have both adopted updates to ISO 1305, and 1345 has in itself adopted changes to based on the Congressional Federal Regulations. So these two very much go hand in hand. So much so now that the FDA participates in the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum that's in support of global alignment with medical device regulations, particularly ISO 13005. So a lot of Europe has adopted ISO 1345 to a T, and then now the US, in order to harmonize those, has tried to align itself a lot more with 1345 so that when you make a medical device, it can be applicable not just in Europe and the US, but worldwide as well. Now, having said that, I want to dive into the individual sections of ISO 1345 that are applicable for this course so that we can understand how to set up our framework within a medical device company. The first section is the scope and is actually a great introduction to the rest of the document. So right in the beginning of the standard, it says that the scope of this international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system where an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to provide medical devices and related services that consistently meet customer and applicable regulatory requirements. It applies to organizations at many different fronts, and some of them are all-encompassing of these. Some of them only handle one aspect of this. But whether it's the design, the development, and the production stage, it could just be the storage and distribution and installation, or maybe the servicing and disposal of medical devices, all of them should conform to something within a quality management system. It includes requirements for suppliers and then external parties providing products and services, and focuses on regulatory compliance and risk management. Now, some of the next sections of the standard describe, for instance, section outline and an overview of the standard and definitions. So we're going to skip ahead to section 4, which is the broad QMS requirements. Now, the core requirements is that a company must establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve a QMS system. And we'll talk about how a company would fundamentally establish a QMS, but then we'll talk about that maintenance and continual improvement in some of the later sections of this lecture. And also, because companies usually develop these from the ground up as they're establishing their company, a company also needs to identify processes needed in their interactions within a QMS. Now, because a QMS system or a QMS describes how a company should operate, in order to ensure regulatory compliance with that operation, you need to document how you're doing that. So, at its core, and perhaps to describing in a very boring way, the QMS is really a documentation system, or I should say, the documentation is a way to verify that you are in compliance with QMS requirements. So, a core fundamental aspect of that are the documentation requirements, and that's outlined in section 4.2, where you need to show control of documents and records. And these things need to have review and approval of those documents and any kind of changes. And you need to show versioning of those controlled documents. So it's not exactly trivial to write up a document that describes your company hierarchy, or perhaps it's a record of training. It could also be a documentation on your benchtop procedures, or you ran some tests on your medical device and you want to show how well or maybe how poorly it did. But once you establish those and they've been reviewed and approved by management, they would go into your filing system, your documentation system, aka your QMS. And then any subsequent changes to those, it could be improvements, it could be amendments to any kind of mistakes that you saw. You need to have versioning control. So the first document would be version 1, and then you notice a mistake, you make a change, you call that version 2, or maybe you have a different numbering system. You want version 1.1 to show that minor amendment, or it could be a big amendment. And then that second version gets reviewed and approved by anyone with signature authority. And then that next version gets updated as well. So it's not trivial to just make a change to something, and you can't change an original document without documenting that sort of versioning or that update. And then you have to show that that update got approval from anyone within a particular authority within that. Now, I just mentioned control of documents and records. I want to highlight some of the small but fundamental differences between those. So, looking on the table on the right, a control of documents describes how we manage documents that are used to guide the processes of operating within a QMS, whereas records are more evidence of process results or compliance with certain things. So, looking at particular examples, documents that describe procedures, work instructions, or manuals are going to be something that are continuously updated as the evolution or a company evolves within their building and growing QMS. Whereas records might be inspection records, training logs, calibration, and they're really unchanged after their original creation. It doesn't make sense to do a calibration and then somehow amend that based on later information. Maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with the calibration process or wrong with a certain training record, but usually that's not something that you change after the fact. You might redo training and then you have a new record of new training. You might redo inspections or calibrations, but the data is the data. Unless something was fundamentally wrong with the creation of that record in itself, that's going to remain unchanged. And then there's going to be the retention. So really, you only keep old versions of documents as long as they're useful for a particular operation. But training records, test data, or calibration data records, that's going to be something that a regulatory body is going to want to see, even going back as far as history. So if there's a fault with a medical product, they want to say, well, is there anything within your manufacturing process? Was it out of calibration? Was it out of inspection? You're not going to get rid of those records because a regulatory body is going to want to see that. So, and then fundamentally, its usage is that the control of documents helps guides activities within a company, whereas the control of record is useful for showing that activities or requirements were maintained and that they're proof of that. Now, what does versioning and what does approval actually look like? Well, before computers were so ubiquitous, almost every document or record would have some sort of title sheet that, or a cover page that would describe the title, its date that it was created, and there'd actually be spaces for the names of those that had signature or approval authority, where they would actually hand sign these things. And then there'd be a log of all the version and the version history of that particular document or maybe record. So this would be a spot where those would actually sign off on it or describe those changes. Now, since then, companies have started to evolve, and as again, computers are now sort of ubiquitous within the industry. We even have digital versions of these where all documents we even have that same kind of cover sheet, but they would be digitally signed. And the FDA even has ways of describing what sort of compliance you need with digital signatures and how to ensure that they come from the actual signer themselves and wasn't just a digital copy of a signature. So things like DocuSign and certain QMS specific companies would have to have their signature system be compliant with that code of federal regulations. Now, some companies have even moved beyond this sort of historic hand signing digitalized version of that. And there are even specialized software systems that collect this and have more digital stamps that kind of get away from actual signatures, but still maintain the requirements of this authority process. Now, what's going to describe how to go about this exact process is your quality manual. That's going to describe the procedures for creating, reviewing, and approving, and then even updating documents. And any subsequent maintenance or auditing of the quality manual is going to detail the scope, processes, interactions within the QMS. And a medical device file is a part of that documentation system. That's not going to describe how your company operates. That's not going to describe or tell people how to make updates to any documents. A medical device file is any documentation related directly to a medical device. It could be manufacturing procedures, testing procedures, product specifications. It could be any kind of brainstorming sessions or risk management sessions related to a particular medical device. But there's both documentation on how a company operates, and then a subpart of that is documentation on any medical devices that that company makes in itself. Now, the next section, section 5, describes management responsibility. Now, the scope for this section is that top management shall provide evidence of its commitment to the development and implementation of the quality management system and maintenance of its effectiveness. So it's not just simple enough to establish a quality policy, but you have to both do this and provide records that it's reviewed, communicated, and understood within the organization. Now, this section describes essential activities for management is to ensure customer and regulatory requirements are met, establishes a quality policy, ensures that quality objectives are established and met. It defines organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities, and that's specific to the QMS system. And then also conducts management reviews to assess QMS effectiveness. So it's almost like you have to audit yourself. You have to describe evidence of brainstorming and meetings within top management on how well the QMS is going and to propose any sort of updates along with that process. Now, section 5.5 within that section goes a little bit further. It says that roles are defined, documented, and communicated. Those assigned to the QMS system to ensure quality standards are met have the independence and authority to do so. So you kind of lay out the responsibilities of those that are in sort of the top management sections. Whoever is in charge of the QMS and ensure that's being effective needs to have the proper authority to maintain its effectiveness. Appointed quality staff ensure the promotion and awareness of regulatory requirements. So you can't just have one person in charge. You need to make sure that all employees are somehow trained on this, that you have records of their training, and that they even promote the activities and awareness of these particular regulatory and QMS requirements. And then finally, a system for communication is established within the organization for the purposes of discussing quality effectiveness. Now, one thing that I'll pause for a minute. What I really like about these standards is that they don't tell a company exactly what to do. Hey, you need to meet once a week to discuss effectiveness. You need to document it using this particular form. A company can better describe and dictate themselves how to best go about that. And every company is going to be different and every company is going to be unique. So therefore, the standard isn't saying, hey, do exactly this. It kind of says, well, you need to come up with a way to describe this. You need to maintain records however you think that's most appropriate. And then it's that company's responsibility to make sure that whatever they come up with is in compliance with this ISO standard. And that's going to meet outside and external scrutiny come audit time whenever the FDA comes knocking. Now, section 5.6 talks about one of those essential activities in detail, and that's conducting management reviews. So the scope for this subsection is that requires that executive members of organizations conduct reviews of QMS at planned intervals to ensure suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. So it's not just simple enough to have meetings whenever you think an improvement needs to be made. You need to have these at regular intervals, even if you decide from that particular interval meeting that nothing needs to be changed. I would say that that's probably not prudent enough for a company, but that would be an adequate response as long as you're holding these meetings at dictated intervals in order to do that. So an input from any one of these particular meetings could be feedback internally or externally. It could be audits, again, whether it's an internal or an external audit. Maybe you identify corrective or preventive actions. That's going to be a big talking point in a few slides later in this lecture. Or if complaints were made by customers, or anyone using a particular medical device. Now, output, so as a result of that, there would be improvements to the QMS, there might be improvements to the products themselves, there might be changes per new regulations or updates to a particular standard, or if new resources were identified. And then that's going to be the responsibility of management to implement that as a result of those inputs and the discussed outputs of those management reviews. Now, moving on, Section 6 of the ISO standard talks about resource management. Subsection 6.2 starts with human resources, specifically for personnel performing work affecting product quality. Now, we've probably worked in our own industry environments or have had jobs where we've had to work with HR as part of our onboarding procedure, or you have a complaint about your salary package, you talk to HR, or you have a problem with another colleague, you talk to HR. Now, while the ISO standard dictates a lot about how companies should operate, it's important to understand that this subsection only details any part of HR that refers to product quality. Again, the broad scope of this standard is to ensure safetiness and effectiveness of medical devices, not necessarily of people in themselves. So this isn't what occupational health and safety is concerned about. This isn't concerned with Title IX. This isn't concerned about any interactions between employees and employees. Only how it refers to product quality. So for instance, a company needs to make sure that their employees that work specifically with products, whether in the manufacturing or the benchtop engineering and testing processes, have the necessary competence. It could be that there's certain degree requirements, there's certain training requirements or experience requirements for certain roles that are needed in order to make a safe product. A company needs to provide training, and it needs to evaluate the effectiveness of that training, and needs to ensure that all personnel are aware of the relevance and importance of their activities as it refers to product quality. And then fundamentally, control of documents and records. A company needs to maintain all records of the above. So anytime it hires someone with a particular set of experience, it documents that. And that could be storing their resume in their QMS system. Then they provide training or on-the-job training. They need to have records of that. And they need to show how well that employee conformed to that particular training. And maybe that shows how they improved or that they readily adopted those skills implemented in that training. All of those need to be recorded within the QMS. Now moving on, section 6.3 talks about the infrastructure within a company. So for infrastructure needed to achieve conformity to product requirements, the organization will look at all buildings, workspace, and utilities. They'll look at processing equipment. They'll look at supporting services and logistics. So it could be periodic services of a particular equipment or process. And then finally, again, hopefully I'm not just beating a dead horse here, but document the maintenance activities of all of those of the above. Now, lastly, the work environment. Okay, company needs to achieve conformity to product requirements. The organization will document requirements for health, cleanliness, and clothing of personnel. Now, again, I'll reiterate, this isn't describing what people should wear within a company or a document that says, oh, on Fridays, we're going to have casual Fridays, but otherwise it's business casual the rest of the week. That doesn't at all refer to product quality or the quality of a medical device. But if you need to work in a clean room in order to maintain the effectiveness of a certain medical device or the sterility, it absolutely will refer to the types of personal protection equipment that's needed to be worn there. It talks about the cleanliness of that environment. It talks about the particular work shoes that you might need or the kind of booties that you wear over your shoes in order to make sure that any dirt or grime that you bring into that particular workplace doesn't somehow affect the product or medical device that you're making. And then, of course, document requirements to prevent and control the contamination of sterile medical devices. Now, while the prior sections describe a little bit more about company hierarchies and how companies should operate, Section 7 is really the core one that engineers pay most attention to. Because as engineers, we want to develop quality products and we want to make quality products. So Section 7 talks on product realization. So how does this actually come together to fit within a particular medical device or product? So core part of that deals with product realization with quality objectives. And that's where, as an engineer, we need to actually look at what customer needs and design devices that revolve around those particular needs. Now, a core part of documenting that is what's called a design history file. Now, a design history file, or a DHF, is the documented record of how a medical device was designed. It shows that how the device was developed in accordance with approved design controls. And it's a fundamental requirement under Title 21, Part A20 for devices subject to design controls. Now, what goes into a DHF? Everything from design and developmental plans, design inputs like user needs, performance requirements, any outputs from that, such as drawings, specifications, manufacturing instructions. It could be anything from design verification activities, so tests on the medical device that show how those particular outputs are meeting any kind of user needs, what we call inputs. Design validation activities showing that the device meets the ultimate user needs as it's intended to be used. So you look at the device as it's being implemented within customers and getting feedback to show, hey, it's meeting our core objectives of what that customer actually wanted. And it's also design reviews and design change records as any of the feedback from customers or any from those design outputs is realized to not be meeting core objectives. So it's a continual kind of evolution of that process. And now a core part of that is also risk management activities that are tied to the design of medical devices. Now, risk management is a description of any types of analyses or undertakings to brainstorm and mitigate potential risks associated with a particular medical device. It could be something taken upon at the design stage. It could be understanding the risk associated with the implementation or use of a medical device, as in how a surgeon might be implanting a particular medical device and what could go wrong with that product. It could be something wrong with the fundamental design of a product in order for it to, in case it doesn't meet expectations or certain material requirements, use requirements. It could be a failure or a risk associated with the processing, as in the manufacturing of it. So where could, in an aseptic technique, contamination be introduced, and how do we mitigate that? So it's a first is sort of a brainstorming of any kind of risks associated with the medical device. And then that way you can design around that, or you can implement processes or instructions to help mitigate any of those kinds of risks. So within the industry, you might talk about uh, F, FMEAs or PFMEAs, which are failure mode and effects analyses that describe the sort of brainstorming and mitigation process. And there's sort of sub failure mode design process within the design, the system, the process. Again, we were talking about the manufacturing. And to help understand that a little bit, let's actually go into detail on one of those examples, the failure mode and effects analyses process. So at the start of this brainstorming session, you might outline or list all the components, processes, or steps involved in the design, use, and manufacturing of a particular device. And again, some of those might be subdivided if you're only talking about the manufacturing process or the euphemia, the use of that device or the design of that device. And you would brainstorm all possible ways that that device might fail. So in a euphemia, you might say, well, what happens if the surgeon drops this on the floor in a surgical suite? What should they do in that case? Well, it's possible that they might just pick it up and put it back in. That might be pretty dumb, but manufacturers have to warn against that and put in exact detail in their instructions for use of the clinician. Say, hey, throw this out if sterility comes compromised. If you drop it, just throw it away. So that way it's not left up to the choice of the doctor or their expertise. Hopefully they would still throw it away, but you would try and mitigate that by clear instruction. There could also be packaging design within a medical device that if you're worried about, hey, what happens if a package gets broken and what was once sterile now becomes not sterile because there's a little rip in the package. Okay, you might sort of brainstorm a way to mitigate that and come up with a special package that has sterility indicators built in order to mitigate that. So you just brainstorm any possible thing that could go wrong at any stage of that process, and you start collecting all those particular risks. Step three is to understand the rate and effect, so the severity of that failure. How bad would a compromising the sterility of this package be? Is it a life and death situation? Maybe it's something that could be handled by antibiotics and it's only a mild but still serious risk, or it could be just not that risky at all, but still you have that documented on some sort of scale that you as a company establish. Low severity, high severity. Now, independent of the severity, you'll look at the rate of that occurrence. How likely is that going to happen? Is this a lightning would strike 1 in a million kind of chance? Or is this something that actually might realistically happen half of the time, a fifth of the time, something very significant to a company? So then you take the severity and you take the occurrence, and also you look at your ability to detect that actually would happen in the first place. And you come up with some sort of risk priority number that's a product of those three components in order to understand some sort of compounded overall risk priority of that particular risk. So it could be high severity, but just such a low chance of happening that it's not really worth trying to mitigate because it's just such a low chance of happening, or it's a low overall risk because of that low occurrence rate. It could be a high occurrence rate and a very low severity, which still also warrants nothing to be done. Now, depending on your company's threshold for that risk priority number, you can actually say, hey, below this particular RPN, I might not do anything because what's the point? It's actually just a waste of our resources to try and alter something if it's such a low risk. If it's high enough that it warrants mitigation, then you actually have that implementation put into the design phase, the instructional phase. Like I said, a new package that can detect sterility compromisation, or you have instructions to a clinician say, hey, if you drop that, just throw it away. Or if you brainstorm that, hey, this might not withstand particular loading or fatigue results because stainless steel is not that effective against really high long-term usage, then you say, okay, finally, I need to redesign this product and make it out of titanium instead of stainless steel. And you rinse and you repeat that as often as you need to, and you come up with a mitigation factor that is low enough for you to tolerate within that process. Now, again, pre-1996, you only had to show that you had good manufacturing methods. But now the FDA wants to see that you actually brainstorm any possible things going on, not just in the manufacturing process, but in the design of your device. Don't just wait until a customer encounters an infection or a failure of that device. Try and be proactive and actually design a device with those risks already brainstormed and mitigated in the design stage. And that's what particular risk management or failure mode and effects analysis actually is. Now, I mentioned previously, Section 7 has such a core fundamental attachment to engineers because this is where we design devices to meet a certain expectation. So if you're actually brainstorming a device in the first place, you want to be in compliance with Section 7 of ISO 13885 because it fits within the design and dictates the design control cycle, where you come up with the concept of the design and you plan for that design in order to see, okay, what are customer needs for this? How can I design around that? How can I adopt changes to the design to make sure that it's ultimately meeting any of my engineering design requirements and that those design outputs are verified or validated against the finished device and how it meets customer needs. I think very often where you will get hired within a company that already has a medical device and they want to manufacture it correctly, in which case this section is less applicable. But for those of you that would join a company and design something from the ground up, this is so fundamentally ingrained and it's such a large part of this. It's just not applicable to this particular course where you already have an invention or a device already in hand. So I'm going to skip over some of this, even though it's such a fundamental part of this ISO standard. Now, moving on to section 8, which is titled Measurement Analysis Improvement. The standard says the organization shall plan and implement the monitoring, measurement, and analysis and improvement processes needed to demonstrate conformity of product, ensure conformity of the QMS, and maintain effectiveness of the QMS. Now, a core part of that is what's called complaint handling, which is structuring a formalized process for collecting both feedback and complaints. And we'll talk about the core differences between those two. Outline processes for forwarding qualified complaints to regulatory bodies. So if there's a fundamental problem with the medical device, if it's causing failures, if patients are having problems, a QMS will describe how a company takes those complaints and notifies regulatory bodies with authority under certain defined guidelines and codes. And also a root cause analysis for complaints related to the design, manufacturing, supply, or user errors. So if something wrong happened, you need to do a root cause analysis to find, okay, what's the source of that problem? What happened? Was it a manufacturing issue, a design issue? Did the user use that medical product improperly? And if so, then you need to update your product in accordance with that if it's warranted. Now, feedback and complaints sound very similar, but they have fundamental differences between them and how the FDA or regulatory body might interpret them. So, a feedback is just general input from users, customers, or stakeholders about a particular device. It can be positive or negative. A complaint itself isn't just negative feedback, it's a formal report of dissatisfaction about a product's performance, and it's always negative and indicates an issue with that medical product. Feedback in itself isn't regulated. There's nothing requiring a QMS to document positive things or to show how great your product is. But complaints in themselves, absolutely 100% must be handled per how ISO 13485 dictates, or within the US, how FDA Title 21 Part 820, subsection of 198, dictates. Now, feedback in itself doesn't trigger an investigation, or if it seems to suggest a risk or an improvement opportunity, but complaints 100% always require investigations within the company. So for instance, an example of feedback might be, well, the device is easy to use, but could have a longer battery life. There is that negative component to it, but does it really trigger an investigation or some sort of complaint handling? Do you need to report that to the FDA? No, certainly not necessarily, unless it was somehow thought that the longer battery life or a short battery life impaired the safety of a particular patient. So just on its surface, you wouldn't report that to the FDA or some sort of regulatory body. On the other hand, hey, the device stopped working and caused patient discomfort. Even if discomfort sounds a bit informal or not serious, yes, that's an issue. Does require corrective or protective preventative action. That's what CAPA is. Then yes, it's going to require, particularly if it's a systemic issue and not a one-off. And if it's a serious injury, like death or a safety risk, yes, you absolutely have to report it. If it's not a serious issue or doesn't cause serious injury, it doesn't necessarily need to be reported to the FDA, and there's certain threshold requirements. But usually if it requires a medical intervention, hey, I had to prescribe my patient painkillers, or certainly I had to go in surgically and repair it or fix that problem, yes, then it's going to require a reporting it to a regulatory authority. Now, complaints in themselves, because they're codified by law, and it's codified that you need to document how complaints are received and how they're handled, they're usually front and center on any particular medical device's website, information. It has to be something that is readily found by any particular customer. And if it's not readily found, if you have a complaint about a particular medical device that you have, and you can't find a number on a website, you don't know who to call, that's a fundamental flaw with that company's QMS procedure on how to handle complaints. So for instance, just going to Merck.com, you look at the contact us, The very first number isn't, hey, general feedback. It isn't, inquiries on sales. It's not something market related. Front and center, that support number right at the top, report an adverse event or product quality complaint. That number is directly tied to their QMS system. And whatever you said is going to be a record of a complaint. It's going to be recorded. It's going to be put in their QMS system. And if need be, that recording is going to be supplied to the FDA under certain circumstances. So again, just how the fact that it's front and center and not a sales related, a money related, a customer related call outside of complaints, hopefully shows how important it is. Similarly, go to Johnson & Johnson. You go to the contact us page. The very first thing isn't you want to buy our products, you want to look for a sales representative. No, it's report an adverse event, report a product quality complaint. Something like this, a company say, hey, front and center, we need this at a readily available place. And that's why it's the very first thing that's listed on contact us parts of a web page. Really easy to find these things with a good, valid QMS. Now, those systems describe how customers report complaints to a company. Equally important is how a company then transfers those complaints to a regulatory body like the FDA because they're warranted or because it's mandated by federal code. So one such federal code requirement is through the FDA's MedWatch, and that's what's mandatory for manufacturers and importers of devices whenever they cause serious injuries or death, or when malfunctions are found that could possibly lead to either. Now that form, which used to be, again, pre-computers, paper-based, and now MedWatch has been converted entirely digital, has patient information on the adverse event, the product information, including its medical device code and product number, the medical device information on itself, the initial reporter information, so who observed this, who saw this, and who's documenting what actually went wrong with it, information on the manufacturer, and then whatever regulatory framework surrounds that particular medical device. So therefore, very often, a complaint would be handled via the manufacturer, and the manufacturer would then have to go and fill out this information based on what investigations that they had internal. And a failure to do so would be a lack of compliance with federal code and be outright criminally illegal. Now, beyond the reporting of that complaint is what a company does internally to address that. And that's what's described by the CAPA system, aka the corrective actions and preventative action systems. So corrective actions address existing problems. So again, hey, my device broke. Some patient called it in or a clinician called in through one of those complaint numbers, and that stipulates then a corrective action to be taken upon by that company. Hey, we need to address this. We found out it was a manufacturing issue, and we're now going to change how we manufacture this. A preventative action is one where you mitigate a potential or hypothetical issue before it occurs. Hey, I noticed that our manufacturing system is starting to wear down. I don't think it's going to be effective anymore, and we might be out of compliance. We need to do something about this. We need to upgrade our system. We need to calibrate it better. We need to replace some of its parts. That would be a preventative action. And the monitoring and documentation of that helps to look at these trends and identify systemic issues within a company. So a company has to track whether CAPA actions successfully prevented a recurrence of a particular problem, or if they can document that they ultimately did prevent any such problem from occurring in the first place, such as with that preventative action. And then CAPA findings must feed into a failure mode and effects analysis. So again, you have a complaint that might trigger a corrective action. You implement some sort of mitigation to that, and then you show continual records of that lack of a problem occurring again or ever occurring fundamentally in the first place if there's a preventative action. Now, lastly, Section 8 describes the auditing process of your QMS system. So a company does regular internal audits to be proactive in catching mechanisms that might affect quality misconformities. They have to be scheduled on a regular basis and they have to be documented. You can't just have them whenever you think something might be going wrong. You have to, again, just like the management reviews, do them on a regular interval. And the auditors have to be impartial. You can't have an engineer audit his own work because, surprise, surprise, engineers think that they're great and whatever they manufactured was perfect. Otherwise, they wouldn't manufacture it that way in the first place. So you need someone with no bias towards a particular product whose only job is to look for if there's something that doesn't conform to the QMS, aka doesn't conform to product quality or safety. And the quality teams must collaborate with those engineering, those regulatory, and those post market surveillance teams in order to be effective at their jobs. So, very routinely, internal auditors will conduct an audit, not just to make sure that they're doing things well, but also be a bit proactive, knowing that they're going to be audited externally by regulatory bodies looking for a confirmation ISO 13885. They're looking for a product approval that a product's going through clinical trials or the device approval processes, and they know that the FDA is going to inspect their labs, they're going to inspect their manufacturing processes in anticipation of that approval. So internal audits are a great way to identify any problems at the forefront before then having to go to any of those external processes. A very common process for any particular healthcare, medical device, or pharmaceutical company. So that covers ISO 1345, some of its background, and individual subsections that are going to be particularly relevant for this particular course. So now you're going to use that to implement your own QMS. You're going to implement your own CAPA system, complaint handling system, and company policies to dictate how you're going to work with one another using this particular framework.